Military brat turned military failure, my cousin Derek smirked, raising his champagne flute at our family's annual Christmas gathering. 20 years of service, and what do you have to show for it? A government pension and a studio apartment. The entire room erupted in laughter. Even my own mother covered her mouth to hide her amusement. My father, the successful cardiologist who'd built this medical dynasty, clinked his glass with Derek's and added with that familiar disappointed tone, "Some people are just meant to follow orders, not give them." They had no idea that the woman they'd been mocking for 2 decades was about to land at next year's reunion in her own private jet, with a defense contracting empire that made their combined wealth look like pocket change. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. I sat in the corner of the mahogany-paneled living room, wearing my only decent dress, a simple black number I'd bought at Target 3 years ago for another family function where I'd been the designated disappointment. The crystal chandelier above cast golden light across their smug faces, each one more polished and perfect than the last. This was the annual Hartwell family Christmas party, a tradition that felt more like a performance than a celebration, where success was measured in luxury cars parked in the circular driveway and vacation photos displayed on phones like trophies. My hill. Sister Victoria adjusted her designer pearls and leaned forward with that practiced smile she'd perfected during her years as a pharmaceutical sales executive. "At least someone in the family chose stability over adventure," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Though I suppose 20 years of taking orders from officers half your age must get old." More laughter rippled through the room. My brother Marcus, the hotshot investment banker, couldn't resist adding his own jab. "Maybe if you'd gone to business school instead of playing soldier, you'd have something real to show for your life." The irony was suffocating. These people who'd never spent a day in uniform, never made a life or death decision under pressure, never led troops through impossible situations, were lecturing me about real achievement. They saw my military service as a phase, a detour from the real path of climbing corporate ladders and accumulating status symbols. To them, I was the family charity case, the one who'd somehow lost her way and never found it back. My Aunt Rebecca, married to a real estate mogul, gestured toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased their sprawling estate. "Derek's new yacht is absolutely gorgeous," she gushed. 42 feet of pure luxury. You should see the master cabin." She turned to me with that pitying look I knew so well. "Sarah, dear, when was the last time you took a real vacation? Somewhere that doesn't involve camping or those dreadful military base lodges?" I smiled politely and sipped my wine, the same cheap bottle I'd brought as my contribution, while everyone else had arrived with vintage champagnes and rare whiskeys. "I've been keeping busy," I replied quietly, which only seemed to amuse them. More. Keeping busy. If only they knew what that actually meant. If only they understood that while they were posting LinkedIn updates about quarterly earnings, I was closing multi-million-dollar contracts with the Pentagon. While they were networking at country club events, I was building relationships with defense secretaries and joint chiefs of staff. "Busy doing what exactly?" my cousin Jennifer asked, her voice sharp with curiosity and condescension. She'd recently been promoted to senior partner at her law firm and never missed an opportunity to mention it. "Last I heard, you were still doing that consulting thing. What do you even consult on? How to march in formation?" The room exploded in laughter again. Even the younger cousins, barely out of college themselves, joined in the amusement at my expense. The consulting thing. That's what they called it. That dismissive little phrase that reduced everything I'd built to a hobby, a side project that wasn't worth their attention or respect. They had no idea that my consulting thing had grown into something that would make their achievements look like participation trophies. They didn't know about the classified contracts, the specialized weapons systems, the cybersecurity protocols that kept their comfortable civilian lives safe. They just saw a woman in an off-the-rack dress who drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic and lived modestly. My father cleared his throat, commanding attention as he always did. Dr. William Hartwell, the patriarch who'd built a medical empire spanning 3 states, looked at me with that familiar mixture of disappointment and resignation. "Sarah's always been different," he announced to the room, as if I weren't sitting right there. "While the rest of you were building careers, she was off playing war games. 20 years of government work, and she's got nothing to show for it." But stories about foreign countries most of us wouldn't visit on vacation. The weight of their judgment pressed down on me like a physical force. 20 years of this. 2 decades of being treated like the family disappointment. The one who'd chosen service over success, duty over dollars. They measured worth in stock, portfolios and square footage, in designer labels and exotic vacations. My military decorations meant nothing to them. My combat experience was irrelevant. The fact that I'd led soldiers through hostile territory, that I'd made decisions that saved lives and protected freedoms they took for granted, none of that mattered in their world of profit margins and quarterly reports. But as I sat there, listening to their laughter echo off the walls of this monument to materialism, something had shifted inside me. I wasn't the same broken woman who'd left the army 3 years ago, wondering if civilian life would ever make sense. I wasn't the lost veteran who'd struggled to translate military experience into corporate speak. The woman they were mocking had quietly, methodically, built something extraordinary while they were busy congratulating themselves on their conventional successes. I thought about the hangar where my Gulfstream G650 was currently parked, its engines maintained by the same precision standards I'd learned in the military. I thought about the defense contracts worth more than their combined annual incomes, the security clearances that gave me access to opportunities they couldn't even imagine. While they were networking at charity galas, I was briefing senators on national security issues. While they were celebrating promotions and bonuses, I was building an empire that operated in the shadows of their understanding. The laughter continued, around me, but for the first time in 20 years, it didn't wound me. It clarified something instead. These people who'd spent decades making me feel small, making me question my choices, making me apologize for my service, they had no idea who I'd become. They saw what they expected to see: the family failure, the military washout, the woman who'd never quite figured out how to succeed in the real world. They had exactly 11 months and 3 weeks to enjoy their superiority. Next Christmas, when the family gathered for another round of status competitions and subtle humiliations, things would be different. Very different. The woman they'd dismissed as a failure would arrive in style, and they'd finally understand what real success looked like. But until then, I would smile, nod, and let them enjoy their ignorance just a little longer. The Hartwell family estate sprawled across 15 acres of manicured perfection in Greenwich, Connecticut, where old money whispered its superiority through every meticulously planned detail. The main house, a Georgian colonial masterpiece with its symmetrical facade and towering white columns, had been my grandfather's pride when he'd built his pharmaceutical fortune in the 1960s. Now it served as the backdrop for our family's monthly gatherings, each one more suffocating than the last. I stood near the marble fireplace, watching my relatives navigate the living room like peacocks displaying their plumage. The Persian rugs beneath their Italian leather shoes cost more than most people's cars, and the oil paintings lining the walls depicted ancestors who'd never worked a day of manual labor in their lives. Everything here screamed inherited privilege and unchallenged assumptions about what constituted real achievement. Victoria glided past me in her silk Hermes dress, her wedding ring catching the light from the imported crystal chandelier. She'd married into pharmaceutical royalty, combining her sales expertise with her husband's family connections to build what she loved calling a healthcare empire. Her success story was the kind the family adored: strategic, profitable, and completely within their understanding of how the world worked. She paused to air kiss our Aunt Margaret, whose interior design business catered exclusively to Manhattan's elite. "Did you see the spread in Architectural Digest featuring the penthouse I designed for the tech billionaire?" Margaret gushed, her voice carrying across the room with practiced projection. 6 pages of pure editorial gold. The waiting list for my services is now 18 months. She glanced in my direction with that familiar mixture of pity and superiority. "Of course, not everyone appreciates fine design. Some people are content with government-issued furniture and barracks aesthetics." The barb stung, but only because it revealed how completely they misunderstood my life. They assumed that 20 years in the military meant 20 years of deprivation, of making do with institutional mediocrity. They had no concept of the precision, the attention to detail, the operational excellence that military service had ingrained in every aspect of my thinking. While they saw limitations, I'd learned systems and processes that Fortune 500 companies paid millions to consultant firms to replicate. My cousin Derek dominated the conversation near the wet bar, regaling a captive audience with stories about his latest business acquisition. His private equity firm had just purchased a chain of luxury car dealerships, and he was basking in the validation that came with expanding his portfolio. "The beauty of leverage," he explained to my younger cousins who hung on his every word, "is turning other people's money into your own success story. Military people never understand finance because they're trained to follow orders, not make strategic decisions." I sipped my wine and observed the family dynamics that had shaped my entire childhood. This was their natural habitat, a world where worth was measured in net worth, where respect was earned through market performance, and where anyone who chose service over self-enrichment was viewed as fundamentally naive. My father held court, near the grand piano, discussing his latest medical conference presentation, while my mother showed off photographs from their recent Mediterranean cruise. "Sarah's always been our little idealist," my mother announced when she noticed me listening from across the room. Patricia Hartwell had perfected the art of backhanded compliments over her 35 years as a doctor's wife. Even as a child, she was more interested in playing with toy soldiers than playing house. We should have known she'd choose duty over practical considerations. The comment drew knowing chuckles from the assembled relatives who'd watched my trajectory with varying degrees of bewilderment. The family mythology had crystallized around my decision to attend West Point, instead of following the expected path, to an Ivy League business or medical program. At 18, I'd shocked everyone by choosing military service over the comfortable track that had been laid out for me since birth. They'd treated it as a phase, a rebellious detour that would eventually lead me back to their world of corporate ladders and country club memberships. Marcus leaned against the imported Italian marble countertop, his Patek Philippe watch glinting, as he gestured emphatically about his latest merger deal. "The defense sector is so bureaucratic," he said, clearly performing for his audience. "Everything takes forever because nobody's incentivized to move quickly. Private sector efficiency would revolutionize government operations if they'd let us show them how it's done." His wife nodded appreciatively, her medical practice having benefited enormously from Marcus's financial connections. The irony was overwhelming. Here were people who'd never competed for anything more challenging than a promotion or a country club membership, lecturing about efficiency and strategic thinking. They operated in a world of quarterly reports and annual bonuses, where the biggest risk was a bad investment or a difficult client. They had no comprehension of what it meant to make decisions under fire, to lead teams through life or death situations, to build trust and competence in environments where failure meant catastrophic consequences. Jennifer approached me with that concerned expression she'd perfected during her rise through the legal profession. "Sarah, we worry about you sometimes," she said in a stage whisper that ensured nearby relatives could overhear. "Living alone in that tiny apartment, no family of your own, no real career prospects now that you're out of the service. Have you considered that maybe it's time to leverage some of the family connections? I could introduce you to people in corporate security, maybe help you find something more suitable." Corporate security. The suggestion was delivered with such earnest condescension that I almost laughed out loud. These people who spent their days in climate-controlled offices, whose biggest security concern was whether their parking garage was well lit, wanted to help me find suitable work in their world. They had no idea that I held security clearances that would make their corporate access badges look like playground passes. The younger generation clustered around the antique chess set, their conversations peppered with references to startup, valuations, and cryptocurrency investments. My cousin David's son, fresh out of Harvard Business School, was explaining his internship at a venture capital firm with the enthusiasm of someone who'd discovered fire. The military mindset is so linear, he pontificated to his cousins. In the innovation economy, you need to think in multiple dimensions, adapt quickly to changing market conditions. Hierarchical thinking is basically obsolete. I watched him perform his expertise for an audience that had never questioned whether their advantages were earned or inherited. These were people who'd grown up with trust funds and family connections, who'd attended elite universities as legacies rather than merit scholars, who'd walked into careers that had been paved for them by previous generations of privilege. Yet, somehow, they'd convinced themselves that their success was purely the result of superior intelligence and strategic thinking. The conversation flowed around me like a river I was no longer interested in swimming in. They discussed vacation homes and private school decisions, investment strategies, and charity board appointments. Every topic reinforced their shared assumption that success meant accumulating symbols of wealth and status, that achievement was measured in possessions and social positioning. What they couldn't see, what they'd never bothered to investigate, was how thoroughly their assumptions had blinded them to reality. While they'd been networking and deal-making within their insular world of inherited advantage, I'd been building something they couldn't comprehend. Their expertise was narrow, specialized to their particular corners of a system they'd never had to question. My education had been broader, deeper, tested under conditions that would have shattered their confidence in minutes. But I sat quietly in their midst, letting their certainty wash over me like background noise. They needed to believe I was the family failure, the cautionary tale about choosing duty over dollars. It made their own choices feel validated, their success feel deserved. In 11 months and 3 weeks, when my Gulfstream touched down for the reunion, that comfortable mythology would explode like an improvised device they never saw coming. The pattern hadn't emerged overnight. It was woven into the fabric of my childhood so gradually that I barely noticed when being overlooked became my default setting. This wasn't about a single incident or one cruel comment that scarred me for life. It was subtler than that, more insidious, a systematic erosion of my place in the family hierarchy that began before I was old enough to understand what was happening. I was 12 when Victoria got accepted to Princeton early admission, and the house transformed into a celebration center for weeks. Banners hung from the staircase, congratulatory flowers filled every surface, and my parents hosted 3 separate dinner parties to show off their brilliant daughter. The local newspaper even ran a feature story about the young academic star from Greenwich's prestigious Hartwell family. Victoria's acceptance letter was framed and hung in my father's study, where every visitor could admire this testament to superior parenting and genetic excellence. That same year, I made the varsity soccer team as a 7th grader, something that hadn't happened at Greenwich Academy in over a decade. I was the youngest player to ever earn a starting position, and my coach called it exceptional athletic achievement. When I brought home the letter announcing my selection, my mother glanced at it briefly and said, "That's nice, dear. Can you help me address these invitations for Victoria's celebration party?" The letter disappeared into a kitchen drawer, never to be mentioned again. The family mythology had already been established. Victoria was the academic genius, Marcus was the mathematical prodigy destined for Wall Street, and I was simply there, a third child who filled out the family portrait, but didn't contribute anything particularly noteworthy. My achievements were acknowledged with distracted nods, before conversations quickly pivoted back to my siblings' more impressive accomplishments. When Victoria graduated summa cum laude from Princeton, the family threw a garden party for 200 guests. Local politicians attended, business leaders offered toasts, and my grandfather announced a substantial donation to the university in Victoria's honor. The Princeton Alumni magazine featured her in their Rising Stars section, and my parents kept copies strategically placed throughout the house for months afterward. Marcus's graduation from MIT was similarly celebrated. The guest list read like a who's who of Connecticut's financial elite, and 3 different investment firms recruited him before he'd even walked across the stage. My father spent the entire summer introducing Marcus to business contacts, setting up informational interviews, and arranging networking opportunities that would launch his son's career into the stratosphere. My West Point acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday in March during my senior year. I remember the moment clearly because I'd been checking the mail obsessively for weeks, knowing that military academy appointments were typically announced in early spring. The thick envelope bore the distinctive seal that meant acceptance, and my hands trembled as I opened it to confirm what I'd hoped for since visiting the campus 2 years earlier. I burst through the front door calling for my parents, the letter clutched in my shaking hands. "Mom, Dad, I got in! I got accepted to West Point!" My mother was arranging flowers in the front hall, preparing for another of her committee meetings. She looked up with a confused expression, as if I'd announced something incomprehensible. "West Point?" she repeated slowly. "You mean that military school? Sarah, we discussed this. You should be focusing on real universities, places where you can get a proper education and meet appropriate people." My father emerged from his study, already frowning before he'd heard the news. When I showed him the acceptance letter, his expression darkened further. "This is ridiculous," he said, barely glancing at the document that represented years of preparation and academic achievement. "Military service is for people who don't have better options. You're a Hartwell. We don't send our children to become soldiers." He handed the letter back to me like it was contaminated with something distasteful. The contrast was stark and devastating. Victoria's Princeton acceptance had been framed and displayed. Marcus's MIT letter had been photocopied and sent to relatives across the country. My West Point appointment was treated like a mistake that needed to be corrected, a lapse in judgment. That embarrassed the family rather than making them proud. During senior year, while my classmates celebrated their college acceptances and planned their futures, I found myself defending my choice at every family gathering. Aunts and uncles expressed concern about my unusual decision. Cousins asked if I'd considered real colleges, and my parents introduced me to family friends with apologetic explanations about my temporary interest in military service. The graduation party they threw for me was perfunctory compared to the elaborate celebrations they'd hosted for my siblings. 20 people attended instead of 200. No local newspaper coverage, no alumni magazine features, no networking opportunities with influential contacts. Instead, I got polite congratulations and concerned questions about whether I was absolutely certain this was the right path for someone with my family background. "Military service is admirable for some people," my grandfather told me during that sparse gathering, his voice carrying the weight of generational disappointment. "But the Hartwells have always been leaders in civilian society. Medicine, business, law. We build things that last. We create value. Soldiers just follow orders and break things." His words cut deep because they revealed how completely my family misunderstood both military service and my motivations for choosing it. The pattern continued throughout my cadet years. When I called home with news about academic honors, leadership positions, or athletic achievements, the conversations were brief and distracted. Victoria was building her pharmaceutical career. Marcus was climbing the investment banking hierarchy, and their accomplishments consumed the family's attention and pride. My military training was viewed as an extended adolescent phase that would eventually end when I came to my senses and rejoined civilized society. family holidays became exercises in tolerance rather than celebration. I'd arrive in my dress uniform, hoping that military bearing and visible achievement might finally earn some recognition, only to find myself seated at the children's table, while my siblings held court among the adults. My stories about West Point were met with polite disinterest, while Victoria's corporate negotiations and Marcus's financial deals dominated dinner conversation for hours. The message was clear and consistent. My choices were disappointing, my achievements were irrelevant, and my future was a source of family concern rather than family pride. They measured success in salary figures and social status, in country club memberships and vacation home purchases. Military service didn't register on their scale of meaningful accomplishment. What they never understood was how their dismissal shaped me in ways they couldn't imagine. While Victoria learned to navigate corporate politics and Marcus mastered financial markets, I was learning leadership under conditions that would have broken their confidence in minutes. While they competed for promotions and bonuses, I was developing skills that Fortune 500 companies paid millions to consultants to teach their executives. But the family pattern was established and reinforced at every opportunity. I was the disappointing daughter who'd chosen service over success, duty over dollars, principles over profit. They expected me to eventually outgrow this phase and join the family business empire, bringing my misguided military experience to bear on more appropriate civilian pursuits. 20 years later, sitting in their elegant living room while they mocked my consulting work and government pension, I realized that their pattern of dismissal had become my greatest advantage. They'd stopped paying attention to my life so completely that they had no idea what I'd actually built, while they were busy congratulating themselves on their conventional achievements. The seeds of my invisibility were planted long before I understood what it meant to be overlooked. Looking back, I can trace the exact moments when the family hierarchy crystallized, when my place as the expendable third child became as fixed as the architectural details of our Georgian colonial home. I was 7 years old when Victoria, then 13, won the Connecticut Youth Piano Competition. The living room filled with yellow roses, her favorite color, and my mother spent the afternoon calling relatives to share the news. That evening, my father presented Victoria with a diamond tennis bracelet, explaining that exceptional achievement deserved exceptional recognition. The local paper ran a photograph of Victoria at our baby grand piano, her fingers poised elegantly over the keys, with a caption identifying her as a rising star from Greenwich's accomplished Hartwell family. That same week, I'd learned to ride my bicycle without training wheels. It had taken me months of scraped knees and frustrated tears, practicing in our circular driveway every afternoon after school. When I finally managed to pedal the entire loop without falling, I raced inside to share my triumph, only to find my parents still basking in Victoria's musical glory. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," my mother said absently, not looking up from the congratulatory cards scattered across the coffee table. "Why don't you go practice some more while Daddy and I plan Victoria's celebration dinner?" By age 9, the A pattern was unmistakable. Marcus, 2 years older than me, had been identified as mathematically gifted by his teachers at Greenwich Country Day School. He was invited to participate in advanced mathematics programs, competed in regional math Olympics, and spent weekends attending enrichment classes at Yale University. My parents documented every achievement with professional photographs and detailed scrapbooks that showcased their son's intellectual superiority. I excelled at different things: art, athletics, and what my teachers called leadership potential. But these accomplishments registered as background noise in a household that celebrated academic and artistic achievement above all else. When I won the 4th grade art contest with a watercolor painting of our garden, the ribbon was quietly placed on my bedroom dresser, while Marcus's latest math competition trophy earned a prominent spot on the mantelpiece. The summer I turned 10, my parents enrolled Victoria in a prestigious music camp in Vermont and sent Marcus to a mathematics program at Johns Hopkins. I was shipped off to my grandmother's house in Maine, where I spent 6 weeks learning to sail, exploring tide pools, and developing the self-reliance that would later serve me well in military training. But while my siblings returned home with impressive certificates and new connections, I came back with seashells and stories that nobody asked to hear. 4th grade brought my first real understanding of how differently my achievements were valued. Mrs. Patterson, my teacher, called my parents for a conference to discuss my academic performance and leadership abilities. I'd been helping struggling classmates with their reading, organizing playground activities, and consistently scoring in the top percentile on standardized tests. Mrs. Patterson told my parents I showed exceptional potential for leadership and suggested they consider enrichment programs that would challenge my organizational and interpersonal skills. I listened from the hallway as my father responded with polite disinterest. "Sarah's always been helpful," he acknowledged, "but we're focused on developing her siblings' more specialized talents right now. Perhaps we can discuss advanced programs when she shows clearer academic focus." The conversation lasted 12 minutes, I counted, compared to the hour-long sessions they'd held with Victoria's piano instructor and Marcus's mathematics tutor. The message was clear. Helping others wasn't a talent worth developing. Leadership wasn't a skill worth nurturing, and my particular combination of abilities didn't merit the same investment they lavished on my siblings' more conventional gifts. I was useful, responsible, and self-sufficient, qualities that made me easy to overlook rather than impossible to ignore. Middle school intensified these dynamics. Victoria entered high school as a National Merit Scholar semifinalist, her academic achievements opening doors to exclusive summer programs and university connections. Marcus was recruited for elite mathematics competitions, traveling to different states to represent Connecticut in regional championships, their bedrooms filled with trophies, certificates, and photographs, commemorating achievements that reinforced the family narrative about exceptional children destined for extraordinary success. Meanwhile, I was elected student council president, organized successful fundraising campaigns for local charities, and maintained a 4.0 GPA while playing 3 varsity sports. But student government was dismissed as popularity rather than leadership. Charitable work was seen as nice rather than meaningful, and athletic achievement was considered secondary to intellectual accomplishment. My parents attended Marcus's math competitions and Victoria's piano recitals, but they missed most of my soccer games and student council presentations. The summer before 8th grade, I overheard a conversation that crystallized my understanding of my family position. My parents were hosting a dinner party, and I was supposed to be asleep when their guests began discussing their children's futures. From the top of the stairs, I listened as my father described Victoria's trajectory toward Princeton and Marcus's mathematical gifts that would surely lead to MIT or Harvard. "And what about your youngest?" asked Dr. Morrison, a family friend whose daughter attended school with me. "Sarah seems like such a capable young woman. What are your plans for her development?" My mother's response was delivered with the casual dismissal that had become her signature when discussing my future. "Oh, Sarah's our steady one. She'll probably do well wherever she goes, but she's not the type who needs special programs or intensive development. She's very self-sufficient, very responsible. She'll find her way without much intervention from us." The words hit me like a physical blow. Self-sufficient, responsible. Code words that meant I didn't require the same level of attention, investment, or concern that my siblings commanded automatically. I was the child who could be counted on to manage herself, while the family's resources and attention focused on the more promising projects represented by Victoria and Marcus. High school confirmed this relegation to supporting character in the family drama. Victoria's early admission to Princeton launched a celebration that lasted months, with college counselors, admissions consultants, and academic coaches helping to optimize her application strategy. Marcus received similar attention when his mathematical abilities attracted recruiting interest from multiple universities. When I began researching military academies during junior year, my exploration was met with confused tolerance rather than active support. Military service wasn't part of the family lexicon of acceptable achievements. They understood academic scholarships, prestigious internships, and elite university admissions. They had no framework for evaluating military leadership development, or understanding why someone with family resources would choose such a demanding and unconventional path. The guidance counselor meetings that had been family affairs for my eye. Siblings became solo endeavors when I pursued my West Point application. While Victoria and Marcus had benefited from professional college consultants and extensive family strategizing, I navigated the complex military academy nomination process largely alone, researching requirements and developing my application, strategy through late-night internet research and conversations with local veterans. By senior year, I realized that my invisibility wasn't accidental. It was systematic. The family had unconsciously allocated their attention and resources based on their assessment of each child's potential return on investment. Victoria and Marcus represented blue-chip stocks worthy of maximum support and celebration. I represented a reliable but unremarkable bond that would perform adequately without requiring active management. This understanding didn't breed resentment as much as it fostered independence. While my siblings learned to depend on family connections and resources to achieve their goals, I developed the self-reliance that would later prove invaluable in military service and business development. They were learning to succeed within established systems of privilege and support. I was learning to succeed despite the absence of such advantages. The foundation was laid during those childhood years when being overlooked became my normal experience. Every missed soccer game, every understated achievement, every conversation that focused on my siblings' accomplishments while treating mine as background noise, it all contributed to a resilience and determination that my family never recognized, because they were too busy celebrating more obvious forms of success. The sacrifices started small, so subtle that I barely noticed them becoming the rhythm of my life. When I was 14, the family planned a European vacation to celebrate Victoria's acceptance into a prestigious summer music program in Vienna. The trip would cost nearly $30,000 for 5 people, and somewhere in the planning process, it became clear that 4 would be more manageable than 5. "Sarah's not really into classical music anyway," my mother explained to my father over breakfast, as if I weren't sitting right there buttering my toast. She'd probably be bored spending 2 weeks touring concert halls and museums. Maybe she could stay with Aunt Helen in Boston. She loves the beach house there. The decision was presented as a favor to me, a chance to enjoy a relaxing summer instead of being dragged through cultural experiences I supposedly wouldn't appreciate. I nodded and smiled, already learning the script that would define the next decade of my life. Don't complain. Don't make waves. Be grateful for whatever alternative arrangement they cobble together while the family's resources flow toward more deserving recipients. Aunt Helen's beach house was lovely, and I did enjoy those 2 weeks of sailing and reading and exploring Cape Cod on my bicycle. But I also spent those evenings watching European travel shows on television, wondering what it would feel like to walk through the streets of Vienna with my family, sharing experiences that would become part of our collective memory. High school brought more systematic exclusions disguised as practical decisions. When Marcus needed SAT tutoring that cost $400 per hour, the family budget suddenly required careful examination. My own SAT prep was limited to library books and free online practice tests, which my parents assured me would be perfectly adequate for someone with my steady academic performance. I scored in the 97th percentile anyway, but by then, the pattern was too established for anyone to notice. The summer before my senior year, Victoria needed funding for an expensive internship at a pharmaceutical research company, a position that required her to work unpaid while covering her own housing and living expenses in Boston. The $5,000 monthly cost was considered an essential investment in her career development. That same summer, I was offered a paid internship at a local veterans organization, helping to coordinate support services for returning military personnel. The work fascinated me and reinforced my growing interest in military service, but my parents viewed it as community service rather than career development. When I mentioned that the Veterans Organization had offered to sponsor my attendance at a youth leadership conference in Washington, D.C., my request for the $800 registration fee was met with concerned discussions about family finances. "Money's a bit tight with Victoria's internship costs," my father explained. "Maybe you could find a less expensive way to explore your interests?" I used my babysitting savings to cover the conference fee and took a Greyhound bus to Washington. Instead of flying, arriving exhausted but determined to maximize every minute of the experience. College application season crystallized the family's resource allocation priorities in ways that left no room for misinterpretation. Victoria's Princeton application required professional college counseling services, standardized test prep courses, and application editing consultants who charged thousands of dollars to polish her essays and optimize her interview strategy. Marcus received similar support for his MIT application, with additional mathematics tutoring to ensure his placement exam scores would qualify him for advanced programs. My West Point application was completed at the kitchen table with guidance from online resources and a few conversations with local veterans who volunteered their time to help military academy candidates. The nomination process required letters of recommendation from congressional representatives, community leaders, and academic mentors, connections that my siblings had effortlessly through family networks, but which I had to develop independently through my volunteer work and leadership activities. The financial contrast was stark and deliberate. Victoria's Princeton education would cost nearly $200,000 over 4 years, money my parents happily committed to secure her elite academic credentials. Marcus's MIT program carried a similar price tag, justified as an investment in his mathematical genius and future earning potential. My West Point education was free, which my family viewed as its primary advantage rather than recognizing the competitive achievement represented by military academy acceptance. "At least we won't have to worry about college costs for Sarah," my mother mentioned to friends, as if my choice of military service was primarily motivated by family financial relief rather than personal calling and career ambition. They never acknowledged that West Point acceptance rates were lower than Princeton or MIT, or that military academy appointments required congressional nominations that reflected exceptional academic and leadership qualifications. The summer after graduation, while Victoria and Marcus enjoyed family-funded gap year experiences designed to enhance their college applications, I worked double shifts at a local restaurant to save money for my West Point preparation expenses. Military academy students were required to arrive with specific uniforms, equipment, and supplies that cost nearly $3,000, money I earned through 60-hour work weeks while my siblings traveled through Europe and attended enrichment programs. Even my dating life became subject to family resource allocation decisions. When Victoria wanted to attend her senior prom, the family invested over $2,000 in her dress, shoes, jewelry, and professional hair and makeup styling. The prom preparations consumed weeks of family attention, with shopping expeditions to Manhattan boutiques and consultations with fashion experts who specialized in formal wear for young socialites. My own prom invitation came from James Morrison, a classmate whose father served as a colonel in the Army Reserve. James was intelligent, kind, and shared my interest in military service, but his family's middle-class military background didn't register as socially advantageous to my parents. When I asked about prom expenses, I was directed toward department, store dresses, and drugstore cosmetics, with suggestions that I could do my own hair and makeup to save money. The message was unmistakable. Victoria's social and romantic choices merited significant family investment because they reflected well on the family's status and potentially opened doors to valuable connections. My relationship with a future military officer was viewed as sweet, but irrelevant to the family's long-term social and economic strategies. Spring break during my senior year provided another lesson in sacrifice, disguised as personal choice. Victoria's Princeton interview required a trip to New Jersey that expanded into a week-long exploration of Ivy League campuses, with stops at Harvard, Yale, and Columbia for comparison visits. The family treated this as an educational expedition worthy of significant time and financial investment. My own spring break was spent visiting West Point and other military installations, trips I organized and funded independently through my restaurant earnings. My parents expressed polite interest in my college research, but made no effort to accompany me or contribute to the expenses. They viewed military academy visits as unnecessary since my career path was already determined by my irrational commitment to military service. The cumulative effect of these systematic exclusions was profound, but largely invisible to my family. They saw themselves as practical parents making reasonable resource allocation decisions based on each child's needs and potential. They never recognized that their definition of needs and potential was shaped by their own narrow understanding, a valuable achievement and worthwhile investment. While Victoria and Marcus learned to expect family support for their ambitions, I learned to pursue my goals independently. While they developed confidence based on external validation and resource abundance, I developed resilience based on self-reliance and determination. They were learning to succeed within systems designed to support them. I was learning to succeed, despite the absence of such support. The irony was perfect and completely lost on them. Their systematic neglect was creating exactly the kind of independence, resourcefulness, and determination that would later prove invaluable in military leadership and business development. But they were too focused on managing their more promising investments to notice what their supposedly self-sufficient daughter was quietly becoming. West Point taught me more than military tactics and leadership principles. It taught me how to build something significant while everyone else was looking the other way. While my family assumed I was learning to march in formation and follow orders, I was actually developing the foundation for an empire they couldn't even imagine. The summer after my graduation from the military academy, I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army Corps of Engineers. My family attended the ceremony with polite enthusiasm, taking photos and making appropriate congratulations, but their attention was already shifting toward Victoria's pharmaceutical career launch and Marcus's first-year analyst position at Goldman Sachs. They saw my commission as the end of my education rather than the beginning of my real learning. My first assignment took me to Fort Bragg, where I was responsible for managing construction projects and infrastructure development on one of the largest military installations in the world. While my siblings were attending networking events and building relationships within their respective industries, I was learning project management on a scale that would make their corporate experiences look like summer internships. The projects, under my supervision, involved multi-million-dollar budgets, complex logistical coordination, and teams of contractors, engineers, and military personnel who had to work together under demanding timelines and exacting standards. I was 22 years old, managing construction projects worth more than my father's annual medical practice revenue. But nobody in my family understood the scope or significance of what I was learning. During my second year at Fort Bragg, I noticed something that would change the trajectory of my entire career. The military was consistently overpaying for specialized equipment and services because procurement processes were designed for transparency and fairness rather than efficiency and innovation. Contractors were billing premium rates for standard solutions, and military leadership lacked the technical expertise to negotiate better arrangements. I started spending my off-duty hours researching defense contracting regulations, studying procurement requirements, and developing relationships with vendors who supplied everything from communications equipment to specialized engineering tools. What I discovered was a massive industry built around government contracts, where understanding the bureaucratic requirements was often more valuable than technical expertise. The first opportunity came during my third year of service. The base needed a specialized communication system for a new training facility, and the approved vendor was quoting nearly $2 million for equipment that I knew could be sourced and installed for half that amount. I spent weeks developing an alternative proposal, researching suppliers, and creating detailed technical specifications that met all military requirements while dramatically reducing costs. My commanding officer was initially skeptical about letting a junior lieutenant challenge established procurement processes, but the potential savings were too significant to ignore. When my alternative solution saved the Army $800,000 while delivering superior performance, I realized I'd found my calling. I wasn't just an engineer managing construction projects. I was someone who could bridge the gap between military requirements and civilian innovation. That success led to more opportunities. Senior officers began consulting me about procurement decisions. Contractors started seeking my input on proposal development, and I developed a reputation as someone who could navigate the complex intersection between military needs and commercial solutions. I was still fulfilling my regular duties as an engineering officer, but I was also building expertise that had enormous civilian applications. By my 4th year of service, I was unofficially advising on procurement decisions worth tens of millions of dollars. I'd developed relationships with suppliers across multiple industries, understood the regulatory framework that governed defense contracting, and gained insights into inefficiencies that represented massive business opportunities for someone with the right knowledge and connections. The transition began during my final year of active duty. I started consulting part-time for a small defense contractor that specialized in communications equipment, helping them understand military requirements and develop more competitive proposals. My military experience gave me credibility with government procurement officers, while my engineering background allowed me to evaluate technical solutions objectively. That consulting work generated more income in 6 months than my annual military salary. But more importantly, it validated my understanding of the defense contracting market. There was enormous demand for someone who could serve as a bridge between military requirements and commercial capabilities, someone who understood both sides of the equation well enough to create value for everyone involved. When I separated from active duty after my 5-year commitment, my family assumed I was finally ready to join the civilian world properly. They expected me to leverage my military leadership experience into a corporate management position, perhaps in engineering or project management for a traditional company. They had no conception that I was actually positioning myself to enter an industry they'd never heard of, with capabilities they couldn't evaluate. My parents offered to make introductions to business contacts who might help me find appropriate employment. Victoria suggested I consider pharmaceutical consulting, where my project management experience might be valuable. Marcus offered to connect me with financial services firms that occasionally hired military veterans for operations roles. All of their suggestions reflected their assumption that my military experience was a credential to be translated into their familiar world of corporate employment. Instead, I moved to a modest apartment in Northern Virginia and officially launched Blackstone Defense Solutions, a consulting firm specializing in defense procurement optimization. My business plan was simple but revolutionary: help military organizations reduce costs while helping contractors increase their success rates by serving as a knowledgeable intermediary who understood both perspectives. The first client was the same communications contractor I'd worked with during my final year of service. They were bidding on a $50 million Air Force contract and needed someone who could help them understand the technical requirements and develop a competitive proposal strategy. My consulting fee for that project was more than I'd earned in my final year of military service, and when their proposal won the contract, word spread quickly through the defense industry. Within 18 months, Blackstone Defense Solutions was managing consulting projects for clients ranging from small technology startups to major defense contractors. I was helping military organizations optimize their procurement processes while assisting commercial companies in developing solutions that met government requirements. Every project generated revenue streams that my family couldn't have imagined. When they were worrying about my government pension and studio apartment, the growth was exponential but deliberately quiet. I operated from my modest apartment, employed a small team of former military personnel who understood both sides of the defense contracting equation and built a client base that valued discretion and results over flashy marketing and corporate visibility. While my siblings were climbing corporate ladders and celebrating promotions with social media announcements, I was building a business that generated more revenue than their salaries, but remained completely invisible to anyone outside. The defense industry. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. By the end of my second year in business, Blackstone Defense Solutions was managing over 20 active consulting projects with a combined value exceeding $200 million. I wasn't just advising on procurement decisions anymore. I was helping to shape policy, developing innovative solutions to complex technical challenges, and building relationships with senior military leaders and industry executives who controlled budgets larger than most state governments. The irony was perfect. While my family continued to view me as the daughter who'd chosen service over success, I was actually building the kind of strategic consulting practice that combined military expertise with business acumen in ways they'd never encountered. But their assumptions about military careers and government work were so deeply entrenched that they never thought to ask detailed questions about my consulting business or investigate what defense contracting actually involved. They saw what they expected to see: a former military officer doing consulting work that probably involved training programs or security assessments. They had no framework for understanding that I was operating at the intersection of national security and commercial innovation, where the right knowledge and relationships could generate enormous value for clients who needed specialized expertise. TUI. Transformation from small consulting firm to major defense contractor happened faster than I'd anticipated, driven by opportunities that emerged from relationships I'd cultivated during my military service and early consulting work. What started as project-based advice evolved into comprehensive solutions that positioned Blackstone Defense Solutions as an essential partner for both government agencies and commercial contractors navigating the complex defense marketplace. The breakthrough came during my third year of operation when the Department of Defense announced a massive cybersecurity modernization initiative worth nearly $8 billion over 5 years. Traditional defense contractors were struggling to develop solutions that met the military's unique requirements while incorporating cutting-edge commercial technologies. The procurement process was stalled because military leadership couldn't effectively communicate their operational needs to technology companies who had no experience with classified environments and security protocols. I recognized the opportunity immediately and spent 6 months developing a comprehensive proposal that positioned Blackstone as the primary systems integrator for the entire initiative. Instead of competing for individual contracts, I proposed serving as the central coordinator who would manage relationships between dozens of specialized contractors while ensuring all solutions met military requirements and integrated seamlessly with existing systems. The proposal was audacious for a 3-year-old company with fewer than 20 employees, but my military background gave me credibility that larger contractors couldn't match. I understood the operational requirements because I'd lived them. I knew the procurement regulations because I'd navigated them. Most importantly, I had relationships with key decision-makers who trusted my judgment and valued my ability to translate complex technical requirements into practical solutions. When the Department of Defense awarded Blackstone the primary systems integrator contract worth $1.2 billion over 3 years, the defense industry took notice. Suddenly, I wasn't just a consulting firm helping clients optimize their proposals. I was a major contractor responsible for coordinating the largest cybersecurity modernization in military history, managing relationships with over 40 specialized subcontractors while ensuring the entire program met its ambitious timeline and performance targets. The contract required me to expand rapidly and strategically. I recruited former military officers who had experience with cybersecurity operations, hired technology executives from major commercial firms who understood enterprise-scale implementations, and built a team of program managers who could coordinate complex multi-contractor initiatives. Within 18 months, Blackstone employed over 200 people across offices in Virginia, Colorado, and California. The cybersecurity program's success generated additional opportunities that demonstrated the full potential of my business model. Military organizations began approaching Blackstone directly for consultation on procurement strategies, technology assessments, and program management services. Commercial contractors sought our expertise to help them understand military requirements and develop competitive proposals for government contracts. Each success expanded our reputation and opened doors to larger opportunities. The Navy contracted with Blackstone to modernize their communications infrastructure across Pacific Fleet operations. The Air Force engaged us to develop next-generation training simulation systems. The Army asked us to coordinate their transition to advanced logistics management platforms. Every project reinforced our position as the essential bridge between military requirements and commercial innovation. By my 5th year of operation, Blackstone Defense Solutions had evolved far beyond consulting services. We were developing proprietary technologies, manufacturing specialized equipment, and providing ongoing support services for military installations worldwide. Our annual revenue exceeded $400 million, with profit margins that reflected our unique position in a marketplace where technical expertise and security clearances created significant barriers to entry. The business model was revolutionary but deliberately understated. While traditional defense contractors focused on large-scale manufacturing or specialized technology development, Blackstone concentrated on integration and optimization services that generated enormous value through efficiency improvements and cost reductions. We helped military organizations accomplish their missions more effectively while helping commercial partners access government markets they couldn't navigate independently. The financial results were extraordinary, but the strategic relationships were even more valuable. I was regularly briefing senior Pentagon officials on emerging technologies and procurement strategies. Defense secretaries sought my input on policy decisions that affected military readiness and budget allocation. Congressional committees invited my testimony on defense spending optimization and contractor accountability measures. Meanwhile, my family continued to assume I was running a small consulting practice that helped military veterans transition to civilian careers or provided security training for corporate clients. During our monthly family gatherings, they'd ask polite questions about my work, but their eyes glazed over when I mentioned government contracts or defense procurement processes. They had no framework for understanding the scale or significance of what I'd built, because it operated in a world completely separate from their pharmaceutical and financial services experiences. The invisibility was strategic as well as accidental. Defense contracting operated under strict confidentiality requirements that prevented detailed public discussion of contracts, capabilities, or client relationships. I couldn't post LinkedIn updates about billion-dollar contract awards or share news articles about program successes. The industry's classified nature meant that even my most significant achievements remained invisible to anyone without appropriate security clearances and legitimate need-to-know access. This operational security requirement perfectly complemented my family's disinterest in military-related topics. They'd learned to tune out whenever I mentioned anything involving government agencies, classified programs, or defense contractors. Their assumptions about military consulting work, training seminars, security assessments, policy documentation were mundane enough that they never pursued deeper conversations about my actual business activities. The 7th year brought opportunities that would have seemed impossible when I'd started Blackstone with a laptop and a spare bedroom office. The Pentagon approached us about serving as the primary contractor for a comprehensive modernization of overseas military communications networks, a program that would span 15 countries and require coordination with NATO allies and foreign military organizations. The contract value exceeded $3 billion over 7 years. But more importantly, it positioned Blackstone as a global defense contractor, with capabilities that rivaled firms with 50-year histories and tens of thousands of employees. We would be responsible for designing, implementing, and maintaining communications infrastructure that supported critical military operations worldwide. Accepting the contract required another massive expansion that transformed Blackstone from a specialized consulting firm into a comprehensive defense solutions provider. I established international offices, hired former diplomats and foreign military officers who understood overseas operational requirements, and developed partnerships with technology companies across multiple countries. The program's complexity demanded sophisticated project management capabilities and financial resources that pushed Blackstone into the top tier of defense contractors. We were no longer competing with boutique consulting firms for specialized projects. We were competing with Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Raytheon for programs that defined military capabilities and national security infrastructure. The transformation was complete, but remained invisible to everyone outside the defense industry. While my siblings celebrated promotions and bonuses that generated modest increases in their comfortable salaries, I was building a business empire that operated on a scale they couldn't comprehend. But their lack of curiosity about my work, combined with the industry's inherent secrecy requirements, meant that my success remained as hidden as it had been when I was a junior officer managing construction projects at Fort Bragg. The foundation was solid, the growth trajectory was exponential, and the strategic positioning was unassailable. In less than a decade, I'd built something that generated more revenue than my family's combined businesses, while operating in a marketplace where relationships, expertise, and security clearances created insurmountable barriers for potential competitors. Yet as far as my family knew, I was still the disappointing daughter who'd chosen military service over real career opportunities, still struggling to translate my government experience into meaningful civilian success. The hidden success reached levels that even I hadn't anticipated when the Department of Defense selected Blackstone Defense Solutions as the primary contractor for Project Nexus, a classified artificial intelligence initiative designed to revolutionize military decision-making systems across all service branches. The program's budget exceeded $12 billion over 10 years, making it one of the largest technology contracts in Pentagon history. What made this achievement particularly remarkable was how completely it remained invisible to my family and their social circle. The classified nature of artificial intelligence applications in military systems meant that program details were restricted to personnel with top-secret clearances and specific need-to-know authorization. Even the contract announcement was buried in procurement databases that required specialized access and understanding of government contracting codes to locate and interpret. Project Nexus represented the convergence of everything I'd built over the previous decade. The program required deep understanding of military operational requirements, sophisticated knowledge of emerging AI technologies, extensive relationships with both government decision-makers and commercial technology partners, and the organizational capabilities to manage a development effort spanning multiple classified locations and involving thousands of specialized personnel. My role as program director meant briefing the Joint Chiefs of Staff on AI implementation strategies, coordinating with National Security Council staff on policy implications, and managing relationships with technology companies whose innovations would reshape how military leaders processed information and made tactical decisions. I was essentially serving as the bridge between Silicon Valley's most advanced AI research and the Pentagon's most sensitive operational requirements. The irony was perfect and completely lost on my family. While they continued to view artificial intelligence as something that might eventually impact their pharmaceutical and financial services industries, I was actually building the systems that would define AI applications in national security for the next generation. But their understanding of military technology was limited to movies and news reports about drone operations, giving them no framework for comprehending the strategic significance of what I was developing. During family gatherings, their conversations about technology focused on consumer applications and market trends that generated investment opportunities for Marcus's clients or efficiency improvements for Victoria's pharmaceutical operations. When they occasionally asked about my work, I'd mention that we were developing decision support systems for military planning, which they interpreted as database management or communication software rather than the revolutionary AI platforms that were actually emerging from our research and development efforts. The financial results were staggering, but carefully managed through corporate structures that maintained operational security while optimizing tax efficiency. Blackstone's revenue from Project Nexus alone exceeded $800 million annually, but the money flowed through specialized defense contracting accounts that were invisible to commercial financial tracking systems. My personal compensation reflected the program's success, but the payments were structured as long-term equity arrangements and performance bonuses that avoided triggering the kind of lifestyle changes that might attract unwanted attention. This financial discretion was crucial for maintaining the low profile that served both security requirements and personal preferences. While my siblings' success was measured in visible symbols, luxury cars, vacation homes, designer wardrobes, and social media documentation of their prosperous lifestyles, my wealth remained almost entirely invisible to anyone outside the defense contracting community. The houses they'd begun purchasing as their careers advanced were impressive by normal standards, but modest compared to what I could have afforded. Victoria's Colonial in Westport cost $1.8 million and required a mortgage that consumed nearly 40% of her household income. Marcus's Manhattan apartment represented a $2.3 million investment that left him feeling financially stretched despite his Goldman Sachs salary. Both properties generated extensive family discussion about real estate markets, mortgage strategies, and the challenges of affording luxury housing in competitive markets. Meanwhile, I quietly purchased a 15,000-acre ranch in Montana that included private airstrip facilities, advanced communications infrastructure, and enough space to host classified meetings with Pentagon officials who occasionally needed to conduct sensitive discussions away from Washington's surveillance-heavy environment. The property cost $12 million and was purchased through corporate entities that maintained appropriate operational security while providing the kind of private retreat that senior defense officials valued for confidential strategy sessions. The ranch served both personal and professional purposes, but my family knew nothing about it because it never came up in conversations about real estate investments or vacation planning. When they discussed their mortgage payments and property tax concerns, I listened quietly while thinking about property management decisions that involved helicopter landing zones and secure communication systems rather than neighborhood associations and school district rankings. The contrast extended to transportation choices that reflected both practical requirements and deliberate discretion. Victoria leased a BMW sedan that she considered appropriately professional for pharmaceutical industry networking events. Marcus drove a Porsche that projected success to his Wall Street colleagues while remaining practical for Manhattan parking limitations. Both vehicles represented significant financial commitments that they discussed regularly in terms of lease payments, insurance costs, and maintenance expenses. I owned a fleet of vehicles that included armored SUVs for high-security transportation, a helicopter for accessing remote military installations, and specialized communications equipment that allowed secure coordination with Pentagon officials during travel. But for family events, I drove a modest Honda sedan that reinforced their assumptions about my supposedly limited financial resources and practical lifestyle choices. The most significant contrast involved international travel patterns that revealed how differently our careers had evolved. Victoria's pharmaceutical work occasionally required trips to European conferences and manufacturing facilities, expenses that her company covered, but which she treated as luxurious perks worthy of detailed social media documentation. Marcus's financial services career involved client meetings in major international business centers, first-class flights that he considered essential for maintaining his professional image, My travel schedule involved regular flights to classified, military installations worldwide, coordination meetings with NATO allies in European capitals, and technology assessment trips to Silicon Valley companies developing next-generation AI systems. But the classified nature of these activities meant they remained completely invisible to my family, who assumed my occasional absences involved mundane consulting projects or government training programs. The secrecy requirements that governed defense contracting created perfect cover for achievements that would have fundamentally altered my family's understanding of my career trajectory and financial position. While they measured success through visible symbols and public recognition, I was building something far more substantial, but necessarily invisible to anyone without appropriate security clearances and legitimate need-to-know access. Project Nexus was transforming military decision-making capabilities while generating revenue streams that dwarfed my siblings' career achievements. But the program's existence remained as hidden from my family as my initial consulting contracts had been a decade earlier. They continued to see what they expected to see. A former military officer doing modest consulting work for government agencies, still struggling to translate her military experience into meaningful civilian success. The foundation was complete. The empire was operational, and the strategic positioning was unassailable. But the same operational security requirements that protected national security interests also protected my privacy, allowing me to build extraordinary wealth and influence while maintaining the low profile that had always characterized my relationship with my family's expectations and assumptions. The family reunion was scheduled for the third weekend in June, marking the 20th anniversary of my graduation from West Point. The invitation arrived on expensive cardstock with embossed gold lettering, announcing that the celebration would be held at the family's new estate in the Hamptons, a property my parents had purchased with proceeds from selling their medical practice to a hospital conglomerate. I read the invitation while sitting in my corporate office overlooking the Potomac River, where floor-to-ceiling windows provided a view of the Pentagon across the water. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was literally looking at the building where I'd spent the morning briefing senior officials on Project Nexus implementation strategies, while my family assumed I was struggling to make meaningful progress in civilian life. The reunion theme was celebrating success, with a request that family members prepare brief presentations about their professional achievements over the past 2 decades. The invitation specifically mentioned that this would be an opportunity to share career milestones, business accomplishments, and future aspirations with relatives who had followed our progress from afar. My mother had included a handwritten note suggesting that I might want to discuss my transition from military service to consulting work, perhaps focusing on how I'd learned to adapt military skills to civilian applications. Set the invitation aside and returned to reviewing financial projections for Blackstone's expansion into space-based defense systems, a new venture that would add another $4 billion in contracted revenue over the next 6 years. The Pentagon was increasingly concerned about protecting military satellites and space-based communications infrastructure from foreign interference, creating opportunities for contractors who understood both space technology and national security requirements. 3 days later, my assistant informed me that the Gulfstream G650 I'd ordered 18 months earlier was ready for delivery. The aircraft represented a significant operational upgrade for Blackstone, allowing rapid transportation to classified meetings at military installations worldwide, while providing the kind of secure communications capabilities that senior defense officials required for sensitive discussions during flight. The timing was perfect. The Gulfstream would be delivered to our corporate hangar at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport exactly 1 week before the family reunion, providing enough time for crew training and systems testing, while allowing me to plan the most dramatic entrance possible for what would undoubtedly be my final appearance at a Hartwell family gathering. I spent the following week finalizing arrangements that would transform the reunion from a celebration of conventional success into a demonstration of how completely my family had misunderstood both my capabilities and my achievements. The logistics required careful coordination between my security team, the Gulfstream crew, and the private airport nearest to the Hamptons estate, where my family would be expecting me to arrive in my modest Honda sedan. The preparations included having my attorney draft a comprehensive presentation about Blackstone Defense Solutions that could be delivered without violating any classified program requirements. The document outlined our publicly acknowledged contracts, highlighted our role in major defense modernization initiatives, and provided financial summaries that demonstrated the scale of what I'd built while maintaining appropriate operational security. I also arranged for supporting documentation that would be impossible for my family to dismiss or rationalize away. The presentation would include letters of commendation from senior Pentagon officials, photographs from classified briefings with congressional committees, and news articles from defense industry publications that had covered Blackstone's major contract awards over the previous 5 years. The most important preparation involved ensuring that my appearance would immediately communicate the dramatic shift in my circumstances without requiring lengthy explanations or defensive justifications. I selected a custom-tailored business suit that projected executive authority, acquired jewelry that reflected substantial wealth without appearing ostentatious, and arranged for transportation from the airport that would leave no doubt about my current financial position. On the morning of the reunion, I woke in my penthouse apartment overlooking Georgetown, a property I'd purchased quietly 2 years earlier when Blackstone's success made my modest Virginia apartment inappropriate for hosting the kind of high-level meetings that had become routine parts of my business operations. The penthouse cost $4.2 million and featured the kind of security enhancements and communications infrastructure that defense contractors required for conducting sensitive business from residential locations. I dressed carefully in the Saint Laurent business suit I'd selected for maximum impact, paired with jewelry that included a Patek Philippe watch and diamond earrings that collectively cost more than Victoria's annual salary. The ensemble projected wealth and authority while remaining appropriate for someone whose business operated at the intersection of government service and commercial enterprise. The drive to Reagan National Airport took 20 minutes through Saturday, morning traffic that was light compared to weekday Pentagon commutes. My security detail followed in a separate vehicle, a precaution that had become standard practice since Blackstone's involvement in classified programs had elevated my security clearance to levels that required protection protocols. The Gulfstream waited in our private hangar, its pristine exterior bearing the discreet Blackstone Defense Solutions logo that identified the aircraft to aviation authorities, while avoiding the kind of flashy corporate branding that might attract unwanted attention. The interior featured luxury appointments that included leather seating for 12 passengers, advanced communications equipment for conducting secure business during flight, and the kind of amenities that senior government officials expected when traveling on contractor aircraft. The flight crew consisted of former military pilots who held appropriate security clearances and understood the confidentiality requirements that governed defense contractor operations. Captain Rodriguez had flown transport aircraft for the Air Force before joining Blackstone's aviation division, while Captain Chen had piloted Navy jets before transitioning to civilian defense contracting work. The flight from Washington to East Hampton Airport took 47 minutes, providing enough time to review my presentation materials and mentally prepare for conversations that would fundamentally alter family dynamics that had remained unchanged for 20 years. I wasn't nervous about confronting their assumptions and misconceptions. I was actually looking forward to finally sharing the truth about what I'd accomplished while they were busy congratulating themselves on their conventional achievements. The approach to East Hampton Airport provided a view of the sprawling estates that dotted the coastline, including the property where my family was gathering to celebrate 2 decades of what they considered successful career development. From the aircraft window, I could see luxury cars filling the circular driveway, their German and Italian badges reflecting the kind of automotive choices that my relatives considered appropriate symbols of professional achievement. As we touched down on the private runway, I realized that this moment represented the culmination of 20 years of systematic underestimation and dismissal. Every condescending comment about my career choices, every assumption about my limited prospects, every conversation that had focused on my siblings' achievements while treating mine as background noise, all of it was about to be recontextualized in ways that would be impossible for my family to ignore or rationalize away. The aircraft taxied toward the terminal building, where a black Mercedes S-Class waited to transport me to the family estate. I'd arranged for the vehicle through a service that specialized in executive transportation for defense contractors and government officials, ensuring that my arrival would project the kind of authority and success that my family measured and respected. I gathered my presentation materials and prepared to disembark from an aircraft that cost more than my parents' New Hamptons estate, while carrying documentation of achievements that dwarfed anything my siblings had accomplished in their pharmaceutical and financial services careers. After 20 years of being treated as the family disappointment, I was finally ready to show them who I'd actually become while they were busy looking the other way. The engines spooled down as ground crew members approached to assist with deplaning. Procedures. Through the cabin windows, I could see airport personnel who were accustomed to serving corporate executives and government officials, their professional demeanor reflecting their experience with passengers whose business operated at levels of authority and influence that required discretion and respect. This was the moment when everything would change. The woman they'd dismissed as a military failure was about to demonstrate the empire she'd built while they were celebrating their modest successes and planning their comfortable retirements. The Mercedes pulled through the imposing stone gates of my parents' Hamptons estate at exactly 3:30 in the afternoon, the precise time when cocktail hour traditionally commenced at Hartwell family gatherings. I'd calculated the timing carefully, knowing that everyone would be assembled on the terrace overlooking the ocean, drinks in hand, engaged in the ritualistic sharing of career updates and financial achievements that defined our family's social dynamics. As we approached the main house, I could see the familiar collection of luxury vehicles that always marked significant family events. Victoria's new Range Rover Sport, Marcus's Porsche Panamera, Derek's BMW X7, and various other German and Italian automotive symbols of professional success filled the circular driveway like an automotive showroom designed to impress, rather than simply transport. My driver, a former Secret Service agent who now worked exclusively with defense contractors requiring discreet security services, smoothly navigated around the parked vehicles and positioned the Mercedes directly in front of the main entrance. The timing was perfect. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see my family members gathered on the stone terrace, their animated conversations and gestural patterns indicating they were deep into their familiar competition of subtle, one-upmanship disguised as casual conversation. I took a moment to compose myself before stepping out of the vehicle, adjusting the Saint Laurent jacket and ensuring that my Patek Philippe watch was visible but not ostentatious. The presentation materials were organized in a leather portfolio that projected executive authority while containing documentation that would fundamentally alter every assumption my family had maintained about my life and career for the past 20 years. The sound of the Mercedes door closing caught someone's attention, and I watched through the windows as heads began turning toward the front of the house. I could see my mother standing near the outdoor bar, her expression shifting from casual curiosity to confused recognition as she processed the sight of her supposedly struggling daughter emerging from a vehicle that cost more than most people's annual salaries. I walked toward the terrace with measured confidence, my heels clicking against the imported stone pathway, while my family members gradually noticed my arrival and began congregating near the terrace steps. The conversations that had been flowing freely moments earlier slowed and then stopped entirely as they took in details that didn't align with their established understanding of my financial circumstances and professional status. Victoria was the first to speak, her voice carrying that forced brightness that indicated confusion masked as enthusiasm. "Sarah, you look absolutely stunning. That suit is gorgeous. Is it new?" Her pharmaceutical sales training had taught her to maintain positive energy even when processing unexpected information, but I could see her mind working to reconcile my appearance with her assumptions about my modest consulting income. Marcus approached with his characteristic analytical expression, his investment banker instincts automatically assessing the quality and cost of my ensemble. "Nice ride," he said, nodding toward the Mercedes where my driver remained stationed with professional discretion. "Special occasion rental?" His question carried the familiar undertone of skepticism that had characterized his attitude toward my career choices since college. My father emerged from the house carrying a crystal tumbler filled with his preferred 18-year-old scotch, his medical practice having provided him with refined tastes that he considered markers of sophisticated success. "Sarah, darling, you're looking very professional today. Big consulting meeting this afternoon?" His tone was politely interested but dismissive, reflecting his assumption that my business activities involved modest government training contracts, rather than anything approaching real commercial significance. Smiled and accepted the air kisses and brief embraces that family protocol required, noting how their expressions remained carefully neutral, while their eyes processed details that challenged their established narrative about my life. They were clearly struggling to integrate what they were seeing with what they believed they knew about my circumstances and prospects. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying the calm authority I'd developed through years of briefing senior Pentagon officials and congressional committees, "I thought this might be an appropriate time to share some updates about my work. The invitation mentioned career presentations, and I've prepared something that should bring everyone up to speed on recent developments." The statement generated immediate interest from family members who had spent decades treating my professional activities as politely irrelevant to their discussions of real achievement and meaningful success. They gathered around with the expectant attention that typically accompanied Victoria's pharmaceutical industry updates or Marcus's financial market analysis, though their expressions suggested they were anticipating modest news about government training contracts rather than anything genuinely significant. I opened my leather portfolio and extracted the first document, a letter of commendation from the Secretary of Defense, recognizing Blackstone Defense Solutions for outstanding performance on critical national security initiatives. The official seal and formal language immediately caught their attention, though I could see confusion in their expressions as they processed terminology and references that lay outside their understanding of government operations and defense contracting. "Over the past decade," I began, my presentation voice carrying the confidence that came from regularly addressing audiences of senior military leaders and government officials. "Blackstone Defense Solutions has grown from a small consulting practice into one of the Pentagon's primary contractors for advanced technology integration and cybersecurity modernization programs." The words landed like precision-guided munitions, each phrase systematically dismantling assumptions that had shaped family dynamics for 20 years. I watched their faces as they processed information that contradicted everything they thought they understood about military consulting and government contracting work. Derek's expression shifted from polite interest to genuine confusion as I continued outlining Blackstone's role in major defense programs. "When you say primary contractor," he interrupted, his private equity background giving him enough business knowledge to understand the implications, "are you talking about subcontractor work or actual prime contract responsibility?" I smiled and extracted another document from my portfolio. A procurement announcement from the Department of Defense identifying Blackstone as the primary systems integrator for Project Nexus, with contract values exceeding $12 billion over 10 years. The official Pentagon letterhead and detailed program description left no room for misinterpretation about the scale and significance of what I'd built while they were congratulating themselves on their conventional achievements. The silence that followed was absolute and electric. Even the ocean breeze seemed to pause as my family members stared at documentation that proved their struggling military consultant sister was actually operating at levels of government contracting that dwarfed their combined business activities. The cognitive dissonance was visible in their expressions as they struggled to reconcile official Pentagon communications with their established understanding of my modest lifestyle and limited prospects. Victoria was the first to find her voice, though it carried none of its usual pharmaceutical sales confidence. "Sarah, this says $12 billion. That's—" She trailed off, her mind clearly working to process numbers that exceeded her understanding of government contracting scales and defense industry operations. Marcus grabbed the document and studied it with the analytical intensity he typically reserved for investment prospectuses, his financial background allowing him to understand the implications even if he couldn't comprehend the technical details. "This is a prime contract with the Pentagon," he said slowly, his voice carrying new respect mixed with disbelief. "You're not just consulting. You're running major defense programs." My mother had remained silent throughout the presentation, but her expression revealed the systematic collapse of maternal assumptions that had shaped her understanding of her children's relative success and prospects. The daughter she'd worried about for 20 years was holding documentation of achievements that made Victoria's pharmaceutical career and Marcus's Wall Street position look like entry-level training programs. Extracted the final document from my portfolio. Photographs from a classified briefing where I was presenting cybersecurity strategy recommendations to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, with my face visible among senior military leaders whose names regularly appeared in national security news coverage. The images provided visual proof that the family's military failure was actually advising the Pentagon's senior leadership on critical national security issues. "The consulting work you've been asking about," I said, my voice carrying 20 years of accumulated dignity and quiet vindication, "involves briefing defense secretaries, coordinating with NATO allies, and managing technology programs that protect American military operations worldwide. Blackstone Defense Solutions employs over 800 people and generates annual revenue that exceeds $400 million. The numbers hit them like successive explosions, each figure systematically destroying assumptions that had defined family dynamics since my West Point graduation. They stood frozen on their expensive terrace, surrounded by symbols of their comfortable success, while processing the reality that their disappointment daughter had built an empire that operated on scales they'd never imagined possible. The moment was perfect, complete, and 20 years in the making. Every condescending comment, every dismissive assumption, every conversation that had treated my achievements as background noise, all of it was being recontextualized in real time as they realized how completely they'd misunderstood who I'd become while they were busy looking the other way. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before my father cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the Atlantic breeze that carried the scent of expensive landscaping and old money privilege. His medical training had taught him to process complex information quickly, but I could see him struggling to integrate what he'd just learned with 20 years of assumptions about his disappointing daughter's limited prospects and modest lifestyle. "Sarah," he began, his voice carrying the careful tone he typically reserved for delivering difficult diagnoses to patients. "This documentation suggests that you've been operating at levels of significant responsibility." He paused, clearly searching for language that would allow him to maintain some dignity while acknowledging how completely he'd misunderstood my career trajectory. Marcus stepped forward, his investment banker instincts driving him to analyze the financial implications, even as his personal assumptions crumbled around him. $400 million in annual revenue, he repeated slowly, his voice carrying new respect mixed with something that might have been awe. "That puts you in the top tier of defense contractors. That's Lockheed Martin territory, Sarah. That's not consulting. That's empire building." Victoria had been studying the Pentagon photographs with the intensity she typically reserved for pharmaceutical research data, her sales background giving her enough business knowledge to understand the significance of briefing rooms and senior military leadership. "You're sitting at tables with 4-star generals," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "These are people who appear on CNN, who brief the president. Sarah, you're not just successful, you're operating at levels of influence that—" She trailed off, unable to complete the thought that would acknowledge how thoroughly she'd misunderstood her sister's position in the world. The pharmaceutical industry that had been her source of pride and identity suddenly seemed provincial compared to national security operations that shaped global military strategy and protected American interests worldwide. My mother had remained silent throughout the initial shock, but I could see her maternal calculations working overtime as she processed the implications of what she'd just learned. The daughter she'd worried about for 20 years, the child she'd considered the family's cautionary tale about choosing service over success, was actually operating at levels of achievement that made her other children's accomplishments look like stepping stones rather than destinations. "The airplane," she said suddenly, her voice carrying dawning comprehension. "That wasn't a rental, was it? That was your aircraft. Your corporate aircraft." The statement carried the weight of maternal recognition as she realized that the symbols of success she'd spent decades teaching her children to pursue, luxury cars, expensive homes, prestigious careers, were modest compared to what her supposedly struggling daughter had quietly accumulated. Derek approached the presentation materials with the caution of someone who realized he might have been fundamentally wrong about everything he thought he understood about success and achievement. His private equity background had given him exposure to large-scale business operations, but defense contracting operated in a world of government relationships and classified programs that lay completely outside his experience. "When you say, 'You employ 800 people,'" he asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity mixed with newfound respect, "are we talking about actual employees or contractors and subcontractors?" The question revealed his attempt to understand the scope of what I'd built while maintaining some framework for processing information that challenged his assumptions about military consulting and government work. I smiled and extracted another document from my portfolio, an organizational chart that outlined Blackstone's corporate structure across multiple offices and specialized divisions. "Direct employees," I clarified, watching as they studied the chart that revealed operations spanning Virginia, Colorado, California, and international offices in London and Tokyo. "We also coordinate with over 200 specialized subcontractors for programs that require capabilities we don't maintain in-house." The organizational chart generated another wave of stunned silence as they processed the visual representation of a business empire that none of them had imagined existed. The scope of operations extended far beyond anything they'd encountered in their pharmaceutical and financial services careers, revealing coordination challenges and management responsibilities that dwarfed their understanding of corporate leadership. Jennifer, who had been quietly observing the presentation with her attorney's analytical mind, finally spoke up with the kind of precise question that revealed her legal training. "Sarah, the security clearances required for this level of defense contracting. You're operating with top-secret access, aren't you? This isn't just business success. This is trusted access to classified national security information." Her observation cut directly to the heart of what made my achievements particularly significant within the defense industry. Security clearances represented years of background investigations, demonstrated reliability under pressure, and ongoing oversight that created barriers to entry that couldn't be overcome through family connections or financial resources alone. "Top secret with sensitive compartmented information access," I confirmed, noting how the terminology landed among family members who had no framework for understanding the rigorous vetting process that such clearances required. "The programs I manage involve technologies and strategies that directly affect American military capabilities and national security operations worldwide." My cousin Rebecca, who had spent the earlier part of the afternoon discussing her interior design projects for wealthy Manhattan clients, looked genuinely bewildered as she processed the contrast between decorating penthouses and protecting national security infrastructure. "I don't understand," she said honestly. "How did we not know about any of this? How does someone build a $400 million defense contracting business without anyone in the family noticing?" The question was fair and revealing, highlighting how their assumptions about military careers and government work had created blind spots that prevented them from recognizing achievement that operated outside their familiar paradigms of success. Their expertise in pharmaceutical sales, investment banking, and corporate law had given them no framework for understanding defense contracting or appreciating the significance of Pentagon relationships. "The work is largely classified," I explained, my voice carrying the patience I'd developed through years of educating civilian audiences about defense industry operations. "Most of what we do can't be discussed publicly or shared on social media. The clients are government agencies that require operational security. The programs involve technologies that must be protected from foreign intelligence services," the sigh. Explanation generated nods of understanding as they began to comprehend why my success had remained invisible to anyone outside the defense contracting community. Their own careers operated in environments where achievement was measured through public recognition, media coverage, and social networking that documented professional progress for family and friends to observe and celebrate. Marcus was studying the financial documentation with the focused attention he typically reserved for merger analysis. His investment background allowing him to understand revenue flows and profit margins, even when the underlying business operations remained mysterious. "The margins on these defense contracts," he said slowly, his voice carrying professional admiration, "they're significantly higher than typical government work. You're not just processing paperwork. You're providing specialized expertise that commands premium pricing." His observation revealed growing understanding of why defense contracting could generate the kind of wealth that supported private aircraft and high-end lifestyle choices while remaining completely invisible to anyone outside the industry. The combination of specialized knowledge, security clearances, and critical mission requirements created market conditions that rewarded expertise and reliability with compensation packages that exceeded conventional business operations. The presentation was achieving exactly what I'd hoped: systematic dismantling of assumptions that had shaped family dynamics for 20 years, replaced by grudging respect for achievements that exceeded anything they'd imagined possible from their supposedly struggling military consultant daughter. But more importantly, it was establishing new boundaries that would govern future family interactions and prevent return to patronizing dynamics that had characterized our relationships since my West Point graduation. "There's one more thing," I said, retrieving the final item from my portfolio. A business card printed on heavy stock paper with embossed gold lettering that identified me as Chief Executive Officer and founder of Blackstone Defense Solutions, with contact information. That included both Pentagon and corporate addresses. The business card represented more than professional identification. It symbolized the transformation from invisible family member to recognized leader, from disappointing daughter to accomplished executive, from military failure to defense industry success story that operated at levels of influence and authority that none of them had achieved in their conventional careers. The weeks following the reunion brought exactly what I'd anticipated: a flood of communication attempts from family members who suddenly wanted to rebuild relationships they'd neglected. For 2 decades, the voicemails, text messages, and emails arrived with predictable regularity, each one carefully crafted to acknowledge their previous oversights while positioning the sender as someone who had always believed in my potential despite evidence. To the contrary, Victoria's first attempt came through a handwritten letter delivered by express mail, her pharmaceutical industry training evident in the strategic approach to relationship repair. "Sarah, I've been thinking about our conversation at the reunion, and I realize how little I've understood about your incredible achievements. I'd love to learn more about your work and perhaps explore ways our industries might collaborate. Would you be available for lunch next week?" The invitation was politely transparent in its motivation. Victoria's pharmaceutical company had recently lost several government contracts due to competitive pricing from defense contractors who understood military procurement requirements better than traditional healthcare suppliers. She was clearly hoping that her newly recognized sister might provide insights that could help her navigate government markets more effectively. Marcus's approach was more direct but equally strategic. His investment firm had been exploring opportunities in the defense sector for months, recognizing the growth potential in military modernization programs, but lacking the industry knowledge and government relationships necessary to compete effectively. Sarah, I owe you an apology for not understanding the significance of what you've built. I'd like to take you to dinner and discuss some potential investment opportunities that might interest you. The sudden interest in my business expertise was particularly amusing given that Marcus had spent years explaining why military experience was irrelevant to modern business operations. Now that he understood the financial scale of defense contracting, his perspective had shifted dramatically toward viewing my Pentagon relationships as valuable assets worthy of his professional attention. My parents' outreach was more emotional, but equally calculated. My mother called repeatedly, leaving increasingly lengthy voicemails that expressed maternal pride mixed with regret about not recognizing my achievements sooner. Darling, your father and I have been discussing how proud we are of everything you've accomplished. We realize we haven't been as supportive as we should have been, and we'd love to make up for lost time. The sentiment was touching, but transparently, motivated by social considerations that had become urgent since the reunion. Word of my success had spread through their social circle with the velocity that characterized wealthy community gossip, generating questions about why they'd never mentioned their daughter's defense contracting empire or invited colleagues to meet such an influential family member. Derek's communication revealed the most desperate attempt at relationship repair, his private equity background making him acutely aware of the networking opportunities he'd missed by dismissing his military consultant cousin for 20 years. Sarah, I've been following defense industry news since our conversation, and I'm amazed by the scope of what you've built. I'd love to introduce you to some of my contacts who might be interested in investment opportunities or partnership arrangements. The irony was perfect. These were the same people who had spent decades treating my career choices as disappointments worthy of pity rather than achievements worthy of respect. Now that they understood the financial implications of my work, they were eager to leverage family relationships for professional advantage, seeking access to opportunities and connections they couldn't develop independently. But their sudden interest felt hollow and opportunistic, motivated by the potential benefits of association with success, rather than genuine concern for my well-being or appreciation for my journey. They wanted relationships with the CEO of Blackstone Defense Solutions, not with the sister and daughter they'd systematically overlooked and underestimated for 20 years. I responded to their outreach with polite but measured acknowledgments that established clear boundaries around both personal relationships and business interactions. The family dynamics that had shaped my childhood and young adulthood were permanently altered, but I had no interest in rebuilding connections based on their newfound recognition of my financial success, rather than fundamental respect for my choices and character. The transformation wasn't limited to immediate family members. Extended relatives, family friends, and social acquaintances who had treated me as an afterthought for decades suddenly discovered urgent reasons to renew connections they'd previously considered unnecessary. The invitations to charity events, business networking functions, and social gatherings multiplied exponentially as my newfound status generated interest from people who measured relationships through potential advantages rather than personal affection. Greenwich Society, which had politely ignored the Hartwell daughter who chose military service over appropriate civilian careers, suddenly wanted to claim me as a local success story worthy of recognition and celebration. The same country club that had never invited me to join their business networking events began extending membership opportunities and leadership positions that would showcase their connection to a successful defense contractor. The attention was both validating and exhausting, confirming what I'd suspected about the conditional nature of relationships within my family's social circle. People who had never shown genuine interest in my life or career were suddenly eager to associate with someone whose business success commanded respect and opened doors to opportunities they couldn't access independently. More significantly, the revelation had professional implications that extended far beyond family dynamics. Word of Blackstone's success had spread through defense industry networks, generating increased attention from potential clients, competitors, and partners who recognized the strategic value of working with someone who had built such rapid growth, while maintaining strong government relationships. The Pentagon began consulting me on policy decisions that affected the broader defense contracting community, recognizing that my perspective bridged military operational requirements and commercial innovation in ways that benefited both government efficiency and contractor profitability. Congressional committees invited my testimony on defense spending optimization and contractor accountability measures that could improve acquisition processes. Industry publications began featuring Blackstone in articles about successful defense contractors, highlighting our role in major modernization programs while carefully avoiding classified details that could compromise operational security. The coverage positioned me as a thought leader, whose insights shaped discussions about military technology development and procurement reform. But the most meaningful validation came from recognition within the military community itself. Former colleagues who had watched my transition from active duty to civilian success reached out to express admiration for what I'd accomplished while maintaining the values and standards that characterized military service. Their respect felt genuine and earned, based on shared experiences and mutual understanding rather than opportunistic calculation. The contrast was striking and clarifying. The military officers who had served alongside me understood the dedication, sacrifice, and competence required to build something significant in defense contracting. They appreciated the bridge I'd built between military requirements and commercial capabilities, recognizing the value of someone who could operate effectively in both environments. Meanwhile, my family's newfound interest felt performative and shallow, motivated by social embarrassment about missing such obvious success rather than genuine pride in my achievements or respect for my journey. They wanted to claim credit for supporting me without acknowledging their systematic dismissal of my choices and potential. The decision was easy and liberating. I would maintain polite but distant relationships with family members who had demonstrated that their affection was conditional on their perception of my success. I would build deeper connections with people who valued competence, character, and contribution over financial achievement and social status. The woman who had sat quietly through 20 years of family gatherings while being treated as the disappointing daughter was gone, replaced by someone who understood her worth independent of others' recognition or approval. The empire I'd built provided financial security and professional influence, but more importantly, it had given me the confidence to demand relationships based on mutual respect rather than desperate gratitude for conditional acceptance. The private jet that had shocked my family at the reunion wasn't just transportation. It was a symbol of freedom from their expectations, assumptions, and limitations. I could literally and figuratively rise above the dynamics that had constrained me for decades, charting my own course without requiring their permission, approval, or understanding. Success hadn't tasted like revenge. It tasted like freedom. 6 months later, I received another invitation to a Hartwell family gathering, this time for my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. The envelope sat on my desk for 3 days before I opened it, heavy cardstock bearing, the familiar embossed lettering that had once commanded my immediate attention. Inside, my mother had included a personal note. "Sarah, we understand if you're too busy with your important work to attend, but we hope you'll consider joining us. The family isn't the same without you." I smiled at the careful phrasing. Too busy with important work. The acknowledgement felt both genuine and tragic, recognition that had come 20 years too late to matter. That evening, I stood on the terrace of my Montana ranch, watching the sun set over 15,000 acres of freedom I'd purchased with money they'd never imagined I could earn. The silence was profound and peaceful, broken only by mountain wind and the distant sound of my helicopter returning from a security patrol. My phone buzzed with another message from Victoria, the 15th this month. I glanced at the preview. "Sarah, I miss having you in my life. Can we please talk?" I deleted it without reading further. The truth was, I didn't miss them. Not anymore. The validation I'd once craved from their approval had been replaced by something far more valuable: self-respect, earned through achievement they'd never understand, and relationships built with people who valued competence over connections. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving others wrong. It's realizing you no longer need them to be right. The empire I'd built wasn't just about money or influence. It was about becoming someone who could walk away from people who only loved the successful version of you, secure in the knowledge that you'd always been worthy of better. That's real freedom. If this story inspired you to never give up on your dreams, hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who refuse to let others define their worth. Your greatest comeback. Story might be just beginning.